Next topic we are going to discuss is that of bash variables. So I mentioned already that the bash environment was actually more than an interface to running command. It's actually a way for you to programmatically interact with your operating system. So there's no such thing as a programming language really without variables, so that should not come as a surprise, as a shell environment, and bash in particular as a facility for you to use variables. The data types of the variables that we are going to use in bash, most of them boil down to strings. Okay, strings or indexed arrays or associative arrays. I would say these are the three main type of data that the shell can handle. Index and associative arrays, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we do scripting. Okay, so we're going to leave that on the side for everyday bash command line usage. So we are left with strings. So is everything really a strings in bash? And if so, how do we even manage, to do some arithmetic computation or things of that nature? Well, you may store information as a string in a variable. However, you may, depending on the context, depending on what you use the variable for, have the operator or the command that are supposed to work on the value of those variables interpret what's in the string differently. So some of them may choose to interpret what's in the variable stored as a string as an integer. Some of them might choose to interpret it as a floating point number, and some of them might just choose to interpret it as a string. Okay, so we'll get more into that data type of stuff again when we do bash scripting, but for now you're going to see that even if this may sound a little bit weird when you explain it like that, in practice it's very easy to use. Okay, you just assign values pretty much to variable, and then the context says how we're going to interpret those values. So let's take some concrete examples here. So the first thing we need to know how to do with a variable, arguably, is how to define it. Okay, so the syntax is relatively easy. Here's the name of my variable, no space. The equal sign is right after the name of the variable, and then the value that I want to assign is right after the equal sign. So again, no space at all. Okay, it's really important. And then now that I know how to define a variable, okay, how am I going to use it? How am I going to recall its value? Well, I can do echo, and I use a $ meta character followed immediately by the name of the variable. And there we go. So I don't have to use echo, obviously, okay? I could pass that value. For example, I could say, I'm going to use the ls command, and I pass as first parameter, the value stored actually in my variable named value. It's kind of silly because, well, $value is going to be evaluated into the value 42. This is what I stored in the variable. So I pretty much ask to do a ls42. So in that case, not really useful, all right? That's why I use echo, so that we can check the content of the variable without trying to do something stupid with it. But if I add here, for example, well, there we go, I have my file there. So if I add something like, quote, my file, all right? And then I do, well, just for sake of completeness, I make sure that I have the value of my file into the variable, and then I do ls $value, then it would make a little bit more sense. Okay, I could do things such as, I want to get a ls-l, a long information on whatever file or folder name I stored in the variable value, and that would work just fine. Okay, so you'll notice here that when I assign this value here, I use double quote. Okay, it's just a single word, so really I don't have to worry about the double quote. But if I wanted to assign something like this is my file, okay, well then yes, the double quote would make sense. Okay, so I neutralize pretty much the space character, which means, okay, the value that you assign is this, and then space, here is another argument, space is another argument. No, I want to say the value that I assign is the entire string des space is space my file, so I use double quote. I could use also single quotes with that. Okay, so that would work just fine. It's just a way to actually, for the shell, to neutralize the meta character in the expression that represents the value that I want to assign to my variable. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now, if I do something like, let's just for the sake of being complete again, if I do something like so, okay, and then I display the value inside the variable value. Well, you can see here that the same process always apply, okay, so I had an expression here. I told my shell to assign a value to my variable name value, and in order to compute this value, I backticked it, so I use command substitution. So I executed the date command, and then the result of executing the date command was assigned to the variable value as a string, and then this is what I get when I look at the content of the variable value. Okay, so these are the basics of using variable in Bash. Now, a few things that I ought to mention now. First, there is an alternative syntax to recalling the value stored inside a variable. That alternative syntax is as follows. So this is the value I stored, and I'm going to end the double quote here, and I'm going to start with the syntax we already saw, okay, which is $value. Okay, so this is the value I stored, and then whatever is stored right now in my variable named value. The alternative syntax uses curly braces. So it still uses the $meta character, but the name of the variable is encased in curly braces. So you get exactly the same result. Okay, this is an equivalent syntax. It's an alternative syntax, I should say also. So you get the same result, but you can enclose the name like so in curly braces. So why would you want to do that? Why is that worth even your time learning that this thing exists? Well, let's take another example. So I'm assigning to the variable value the value work. Okay, make sure it's worked. There we go. Now I want to use this value in a sentence. Is this, and I want to recall the value in my variable value. And I want to append, so this is going to be the word work, and I want to append ing. So I want my message to say, is this working? And I just grab the prefix work from the variable value. And no, it's not exactly working. So why do I have a blank there? Well, because the shell is looking at $. It knows that I'm going to specify the name of a variable. It knows that the question mark cannot be part of the name of a variable because it's a meta character. So it takes everything between the $, and the question mark as being the name of the variable. Is there a variable named value ing? Nope. It's not defined, so it's going to be evaluated in nothing. And that's exactly what happens here. So I need a way to say, okay, this is $value, and then ing. So if I put a space, yeah, I get the value that's stored in that variable named value, okay, work. But then I have a space and ing, so that's not exactly what I wanted to do. So let's try to find workarounds. Okay, what if I stop the string here, and then I put the ing here, and that's actually just to neutralize, to make sure the question mark is neutralized. I put a double quote here. Oh, well, it's working. It's working, but it's a pain, okay? So that means that I had to concatenate pretty much two expressions that were each of them weakly quoted using double quotes, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, all right, so this is great. This is working, but this is not great, actually. So this is where the syntax comes into play. The syntax allows you to delimitate, and you're going to see that there's much more you can do between those curly braces. Okay, this is just an introduction to a bash shell variable, but if you go more in depth, you're going to see that you can have like actually complex expression here between the curly braces that operate on the variable that you specify as well. So it's a way to enclose everything that goes into the substitution that is supposed to take place here with that $value. Okay, so if I delimitate the name of the variable, going back to the simple example we're using here, if I delimitate the name of the variable with those curly braces, then I can right after put ing. That's not going to be a problem. Now the shell understands, okay, you want to apply the $, that is in this context used to get the value stored inside a variable. You want to apply it to that variable name, okay, between curly braces. No ambiguity, no problem. This is working just fine. Last thing I'm going to mention in this first video on shell and bash in particular variable. There is a convention, there's a bit of a convention here on how you name your variable. You saw that I used uppercase, okay? If I was creating a variable value lowercase, well, it would be a different variable. So first point of information here, the bash shell is actually case sensitive for everything, including the name of the variables. Okay, and we can double check this live here, like so. So there is a difference between value lowercase and value uppercase. So we could use anything for our variable names, no problem. But the convention is use uppercase for variables that are global variable, also referred to as environment variable in bash. Okay, and we're going to discuss a little bit more what those guys are very soon. And then use lowercase for the names of variables that are local variable, shell variable. So for now, because we haven't yet delved into scripting, for now let's say that the local or shell variables are the variables that you would use on your command line like this. This is kind of an oversimplification, but it fits with what we have learned to do so far with the shell. And then when you are trying to talk about environment variable, I would reserve these for variables that you expect to be able not only to use here in your shell session, but if you start another program from your shell session, you want to be able to use those as well inside that program. So to complete the picture here, because I haven't explained exactly what it means to be able to use a variable in another program, I'm going to have to introduce the concept of export. So export is a keyword that you can use in different ways. You can say export my variable equal something, okay? Or you can say my variable 2, my var2 equal something else, and then do export my var2. So you'll notice that with my example involving export, I use the uppercase. So yes, export is meant actually to tell that a variable is becoming an environment variable, so a global variable. So a variable that's going to be visible beyond the confine of your current shell session. So if I do something like echo $my var, okay, there we go, echo $my var2. So the definition of the variable worked, but right now I didn't do anything special. So the export looks like it's completely useless. Well, let's show you what the export did for me. And to do so, I'm going to first display also the name of a variable that was not exported. And I'm going to follow the convention here that the lowercase variables are not exported, okay? So I have lowercase value that has not been exported. I have my var and my var2 that have been exported. So for now, they all look the same. They're all variables. I can use them the same way in my current shell session. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start an application from my command line. It just so happened that this application is going to be another instance of the bash shell, but it could be gedit, it could be anything, it could be a program, whatever. So the idea is that every variable that was not exported will not be available to that process here that I'm starting. Every variable that was exported has been put into something called the bash environment, and that environment is copied when I start a new program and passed on to that program, so that program can have access to, for example, my var2. So let's run bash here. So I'm running bash inside of bash, okay? Let's try to do a echo $value. It's not there. It's not there because in that instance of the bash shell, I never actually define a variable name value. And if this bash shell is looking up the environment that it was passed by the previous bash shell, it looks inside of it, and that value variable was never exported, so it's not there. So that's why we don't get anything here. Now let's try to do my var, echo my var. This is working. This is working why? Because when I was running in that instance of the shell, I defined a variable named my var, and then I exported it, okay? And so that means it was part of the bash environment for that bash instance. And when I started another process here, that process was given a copy of the bash environment that was being maintained here. So now that process has a copy of the environment in which it can find my var, and it can actually find the value something inside of it. And of course, by now you guessed it, if I do echo my var2, well, yeah, same thing. This has been made a part of the environment of the previous bash shell. So when the previous bash shell executed this current bash shell I'm using, it passed a copy of the environment. In that copy of the environment was also noted that we had a variable myvar2 with something else. So that's a way to pass parameter, configuration option, etc. to things that you execute from the shell. You run something from the shell, you know it will get a copy of the environment of your current shell. So if you export variable in your current shell, those variables and their value are going to be accessible to whatever command you are running. And then if I exit the shell that I started inside my shell, I'm back to my original shell, and in this original shell I can do echo $value, it's still there, and of course echo $myvar, and echo $myvar2, all of this is still there, okay? So that's the concept of exporting a variable. That's actually a very nice illustration of that shows you that the variables that are exported are available via the environment to whatever process, bash in this example, that you decide to start from your command line. Again, that would be true for any process, whether it's gedit or stuff like that, okay? So this is interesting, but there is a little bit of a caveat that I need to mention right now. It's tempting to say from this example that, okay, when I do something like, I need a new name for a variable. Let's call it something equal 42. Okay, when I do something like export something equal 42, it's tempting to say that when I start another process, that process gets a copy of the environment and therefore is able to access the variable something. Okay. And it's really tempting to say that if that process somehow modifies the value of something, then when I exit that process, it's going to affect the original bash, okay? In which I never typed equal something, so I'm going to type it now. And it doesn't. It doesn't because the environment is not shared between the two processes, okay? By shared, what I mean is that the environment of the first shell here that's executing when I export originally this variable something, right? This environment is not the same as the environment that is passed to that process that I start here. What is passed to that process is a copy of my environment. So in that copy, there is a variable something, it assigns the value 42, okay, so it's a copy. But if I modify the copy, then inside that new process, sure, I have a new value, but when I exit the new process and I go back to my original shell, the environment for that shell was never modified. Okay, so that's why I kept saying, you know, we pass a copy of the environment. We make a copy of the environment, we pass it to the process we're starting, and then it can do whatever it wants with the copy. That's not going to affect us. Okay, we still have the original. All right, so this is really important to understand that this is not like a two-way communication scheme. It's just a way for you to define an environment in a shell so that when you execute a command, that command is going to be aware of some variable and some value, but the information only goes that way, from the original shell to the process you start from that original shell. Okay, not the other way around. All right. A few more things I need to mention real quick. How do we get a list of all of those variables that are actually inside of our environment? Well, there is a command to do that. I can type the command env, and the command env is going to list everything that is inside the environment of my current shell. So you can see that here we have the something, okay? My var is somewhere here, my var2, there we go. So you can pinpoint here like some of the variables that we define. So this is quite long. So it shows you everything that is in the environment right now. you can see that besides the variables that we define and export, there are a lot of variables also that are already included by default in the environment and have some values. Okay, so we're going to talk more about that. But right now, let's stop here, and let's stop with just one more little command, unset. So I just showed like the variable something. I have a bunch of variables that I've defined in the session. Okay, so for example, so that the demo is on the screen, I can have access to a variable something, and I can at some point decide I don't need this variable anymore. If I unset something and I try to again display it, you see that the variable has been unset. It's no longer there. Okay, so this concludes our first overview of what you can do with bash variable and how they operate.